Hi, my name is Emily Wilson and I'm the Senior Curator at the C.M. Russell Museum. Today I thought I'd give you a highlight of some of the works that are in our legacy galleries. So if you come over here, we can see the bronze work, When the Best of Writers Quit, that's on loan to the museum right now. It's one of Russell's most important bronzes, and it really shows one of the great things that Russell was able to do, which is create this tension through his modeling between the horse and the rider, and between man and nature. And that was what Russell was really known for, his ability to capture action in bronze. You know, when Russell was a child, even as early as 5, he started making mud pies of snakes to scare his nanny, and take wax from flowers of his sister and make little animals. So really, even though we think of Russell as a great painter for his Western scenes, one of the mediums that he was most familiar with was in clay and molding. Even though he came to sculpture late, around 1904, when he started doing bronzes when he first went to New York, the trip there inspired him. It is one of perhaps his best mediums. So you can just take a look here. So now I'm just going to show you our wall of Russell's early years. Here we are very lucky to have some of his earliest works that he did as a teenager. As you can see in this example and this. Now you can really see the naivety, the naivete in Russell's drawings, but you can also see, of course, the subject matter that continued to inspire him throughout his life. Native people, wildlife, and cowboying. Now this came because Russell was from St. Louis, Missouri, and he grew up in the Bent family. That was his mother's side. And the Bents had a long history of going out into the unknown. They helped create the Great Santa Fe Trail. They built Bent's Fort. One of the brothers, the Bent family, was one of the first governors of New Mexico, and they fought on both sides for the U.S. Army and the military against some of the Native Americans, and also on the Native American side. So he has the stories from both sides of his family, and to him what drew him was this fact that exciting things were still happening in the West. You could still really make it on your own. You could become someone. There was adventure, there was excitement. There weren't as many societal structures or rules, and so for him that meant a sort of freedom. Here's a great comparison that we can make for some of the early artists that influenced Russell. You can see here, this is a lithograph of a George Catlin work of a buffalo, and you can see here how George Catlin really kind of anthropomorphizes the buffalo and the bison, giving him these kind of cute little animal eyes as he stares at you. And over here, Russell has this similar type of look of a bison. Of course, this is before he ever saw any bison. Now, by the time he came to Montana in 1880, the bison had been decimated. There was only a few that were left in the Flathead Valley. Now, it wasn't until 1908, 1909 that Russell was invited by the Pablo Allard folks over in Flathead to help round up the bison to take them to Canada. So that was the first time he really had a great sense of the movement and the actions and the reactions of the bison. And for him, it was just an amazing experience. The difference between trying to herd bison into a corral and herd cattle was completely different. The bison would just jump over the corral. There are some great images of riders almost getting stampeded. And so I think really after this experience in 1908, 1909, you can see Russell's bison kind of transform a little bit. And then also another two early pieces from Russell. And you can see the influence here of Carl Bodmer, who was one of the first artists to travel up the Missouri River in the 1830s and do a lot of depictions of the Mandan Indians and other Native Americans that were along the Missouri River. And this is another great, even though it's a little graphic, you can just see where that great connection is. Now, if we look at this piece over here, we can see that it is done en grisaille, which means in black and white. You might think this is strange, why he would paint in shades of gray, but this was really common at the time by artist illustrators. You couldn't print in color lithograph at the time, it would only print in black and white. So in order to get those really sharp whites and those really deep blacks and shades of gray, artists would paint because it would translate better if you painted in these types of colors. And you can also see he's creating this sort of montage here. You know, this was a technique that, again, a lot of artist illustrators did, especially Frederick Remington, who came before Russell to the West, and it was his elder by some years, and he was just inspired by him. And so you can see this sort of reporter montage of the scenes from the West. Over here is just a really great pairing of two watercolors. Russell created around over 4,000 works of art in his lifetime that we have. About a third are dedicated to wildlife, a third to Native Americans, and a third to the ranching, the cowboy, and sort of other types of hunting in the West. But you know, this is kind of sort of a swampland area of, you know, at this time in the 1890s, he was living through in Utica and Cascade, so these types of areas. One of the great interesting works we have here from the early period is this oil acrylic that was painted on the door of a safe door, a metal safe door that used to be at a bank. It's really important because of the subject here. This is John Youngboy, who was a Chippewa Cree Native American and a really good friend of Charlie Russell's. He was actually one of his first models who would come to Russell's studio, his little shack in Cascade, and then later his studio in Great Falls, and sit with him. Not only would they chat and share stories and give gift giving, but he would model for him. And Russell really didn't have that many live models. He often worked from pictures or you know, sketch scenes from life. But so it's just really great that he had this friendship, and this is also one of the earliest depictions that we have of John Youngboy. Now, as we go over, we can look at another great pairing between a contemporary artist who admired Russell and one of Russell's great bonds, Watcher of the Plains. So here is a posthumous cast of one of Russell's bronzes, Watcher of the Plains. Despite it being posthumous, it's still in really good condition, and it's a pretty good cast. So you can see here he depicts this Native American man who is dressed with this turban hat for winter, and he has his rifle on his lap, and he's looking out over the plains, whether it be for a war party or just sort of keeping watch over what's going on in the area. So this was modeled in 1901, and it was cast in the teens later on. But you can just see the detail, the muscular structure, and the way that Russell really, even though he's a sitting pose, creates movement through the hairline and tries to create the fur of the turban and the beadwork in the pouch that's hanging down from him. And then over here is a 1970s enlarged version of this sculpture. You know, there are some differences that the artist chose. For example, you can really see this sash of bullets over here, but Russell's does not include that. So there is a little bit, a few changes that were made by John Weaver. But interestingly enough, Weaver was the artist that was ultimately chosen to carve and create the bronze statue of Charlie Russell that is now in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. So another great thing we tried to do is not only compare contemporary artists that were influenced by Russell, but also some of the objects that come from his studio in our studio collection that he used again to help model his bronzes and the figures in his artwork. And so here is an example of either coyote fur or wolf fur turban with some feathers attached. So again, just an example of the fact that Russell used his studio props, the gifts that were given from Native American people, in order to create the great artworks that we see today. An interesting long-held work that we have, 4 works that were originally in the dining room at the Russell home, are these 4 watercolor plates that depict the 4 seasons, summer, spring, winter, and fall, that he drew for Nancy Russell, his bride. They were married in 1897, and he drew these and created these for her 2 years later. Perhaps they were a Christmas gift. Russell was really known for doing that, or perhaps a birthday gift, but we're just really grateful that these types of works, and you can see another sort of different work of Russell's here. This was created on chamois, a little sort of canvas depiction of a bison being hunted. Now, Russell often did these little depictions and gave them to friends. So this gift-giving nature of Russell is great to have these more personalized works that we can see. These are some more of Russell's early works depicting Native American people. Russell, again, one of the main scenes that Russell paints over and over is this depictions of bison hunts. This topic really captured his fascination. Like I said, these were earlier than when he ever were able to see bison, but interesting, you can see that again in these early works, his figures don't have as much differentiation. You can see that this figure and this figure kind of look like the same man, really. And you know, what's really fun is that in some of the archives you can see Nancy having photographed Russell, and you can see him pulling the bow back to try and get that muscular definition in some great photographs, and he's in a loincloth, sort of sitting on this saddle barrel, pulling things up, and that's the same type of thing we see here, this trying to get the muscle definition, or what someone might have looked like pulling back a bow and fighting. For me, what I also love about Russell, and this doesn't really change, is that he wasn't afraid to put, the breath of the horse, the blood of the bison, and even the bison spittle, which may be silly, but he continues to do that throughout his career, really showing again how hard these creatures were running, and just the facts that, it's kind of a visceral experience. You can't just hunt without blood, without spit, without sweat. There's all these bodily functions that are going on when you're engaged in this, high targeting pursuit and this really strenuous exercise. And the fact that he shows that, I think, just brings more life to his works. One of the great pieces that we have on loan here is Jumped. Now, this is from his mature period in 1914, and you can see from the difference just from the paintings we previously looked at how much his color palette has changed from these really earthen tones to these beautiful, beautiful pastels and lighting that he really just picks up to really kind of animate that scene. Now, you still get his sort of famous deep, more muddier foregrounds, but he really picks up with the action. You can see again the dust clouds that come up, and for me this is, during this period, Russell was a big film buff. Later in the 1920s, he was down in Southern California scene, hobnobbing with all the famous movie folk and the westerns. So this was before he really went down there that much. But again, you can see this filmic quality and even photographic quality, that you have this sort of panoramic scene here that really just gives you this encircling the wagons. Now, Jumped in itself, again, Russell was a great narrative storyteller. So this tells the story of the whiskey trail that ran from Fort Benton up to Fort Whoop-Up in Canada. And, through different periods of history, there is illegal to have whiskey in Canada, which is what this shows, and then later, around this type of period, a little bit later, you have prohibition in America, and then that was illegal to have alcohol down in this way. So you kind of get this back and forth between that. But Native American people and others would surround wagons and try and get to the whiskey or other merchant goods that these merchants were trying to hide and bring up to Canada and sell. So they would jump the wagons because also at the time it was illegal for Native Americans to have alcohol at all. So you can just see kind of the tumultuous scene that Russell paints here, with people trying to defend their property and others trying to exert their rights to acquire some of that. Over here, again, some of my favorite works of Russell's are these clay and plaster and found object sculptures that he creates. A lot of the times he would pull up, you can see these little tufts of grass, sometimes later these little wooden knobs that he would use, and then he would create these artworks. Now these types of sculptures served in different purposes. So, example, Wolf with a Bone, that work would later become a bronze. So he would create these clay models, paint them, and also then later cast them in bronze. And then there were artworks more like this Prairie Pals, or perhaps this Sentinel work here, where he would use these models and he would light them in order to see the shadows cast. Because like I said in the beginning, he was very dexterous with his hands. He could see animal anatomy much better when he was creating it with his hands through sculpture, through feeling it out. Now, he wasn't an avid hunter, but he did do a lot of skinning of animals, learning about their anatomy and their flesh and bone in the early 1880s when he lived with Jake Hoover in his cabin. So, and of course through just studying wildlife himself. So, like I said, it was great for him to get shadows, and some of these works that he would give to friends. And so if we can see some of those examples that were gifts over here. For example, some of these Native American depictions that are wrapped in these blankets would be gifts he would give to friends. This little South Pygmy he made of nuts. Again, something like a Christmas gift or a little trinket and token. And this beautiful Joan of Arc work, you can just see how detailed it is. Now, it may seem strange that Russell's depicting Joan of Arc, but I said he was a big reader. He read Mark Twain and all these types of other books, romance novels, any type of thing, history. He loved adventure, and he lived next door to Josephine Trigg. She was a children's librarian. Their family was from England, so you have that Joan, even though Joan of Arc was from France, you still have that, War of the Roses over there. So he was just fascinated by England, by Europe. He had went to England in 1914, and I think he did visit Paris and France at the same time, a quick trip over the pond. So he has this interest not only from reading and visiting, but through his friendship with the Triggs, and this comes from the Trigg collection. Now we can see some of his great sort of cowboy ranching paintings. This beautiful work, Mussel Shell Roundup, these works I'll show you are on loan to us, so please come in and see them while you can. Beautiful, mature period, 1919. And again, like I said, you can see that spittle from the cow that comes up. And again, how Russell just uses line and color to draw you in. So it said, you know, you follow the string, you follow the rope, and you can see where the action is and where the danger is. So it's great that he uses those lines to really draw you into where you should see. And again here, when he gets even in his late mature period, you can see he's really added a lot of color through sagebrush through into his foregrounds, which I think really just add. But it's a lot more of a beautiful impressionistic scene. It's nice here, Russell creates these beautiful impressionistic type of really soft strokes, just daubs of color in the foreground and background. But then when he gets into the figures, it's these tighter brushstrokes, these really realistic paintings. So you get that soft, out of focus, and sort of then the really defined action scene. Next to him is a painting in the Eye of the Storm by his protege, Joe de Young. Joe came into his life around 1913 and started really working with him heavily in 1916 in his studio. And this is a later work of Joe de Young's from 1946. It's really impasto. You can really see the globs of paint. But I think it really adds to that effect of being captured in a blizzard and the snowstorm. This type of scene really reminds me of some of Russell's earliest works when he was cowboying from around 1882 or so to 1893. And what Joe de Young himself, growing up in Oklahoma Territory in Dewey, Oklahoma, working in ranches and in the movie industry a little bit, what he had seen. And so you kind of just get this really great depiction of what it means to be the hardships of the cowboy. Instead of the glamour, it's, you know, the cold, the wind, the snow, the loneliness, and just the hard work that it really took to do that. Another great work we have on loan by Philip Goodwin, The Race. Philip Goodwin was an artist illustrator. He lived often in New York, but he came from the Brandywine School in Pennsylvania, studying with some of the great artist illustrators out there. Gosh, let me think of his name. I'll come back to that. Anyway, so you can see just Philip Goodwin, he did this for an illustration for a magazine, for an article. But what I really love about this is, you know, of course, he has this horizontal format, of course, for the magazine, and then the way he just uses line and creates this sinewing from the skater to the open mouth of the wolf, down and back and around. You can see how the river just flows, the freezing, and how Goodwin also uses the color red through the mitten of the man, his scarf flying out, and the tongues of the wolves to also help you bring you back through the painting. Russell was one of his better friends. Philip Goodwin came out in 1907 and 1910 to Bullhead Lodge and Lake McDonald to visit him and paint with him, and we have some great images of that. And so he just learned a lot, and you can see some changes in Russell's palette and color and the way he does his compositions from his time with Philip Goodwin, who is more of an academic artist. So this work, entitled Gunfighters, also entitled Death of a Gambler, is a beautiful earlier work of Russell, 1904. Shootout scene is just so fun to see the dust up here. And you know, you can even see some of the painting out that he did, this kind of ghostly figure that still kind of remains in the boards. But you have this where, you know, everyone has a gun in this scene. The guy trying to dodge bullets, the one who's been hit, the one on the ground, even the Native American over here, just kind of, these two just kind of watching this scene kind of unfold. And what I find really interesting too is the fact that you not only have the action of the figures, but you also have the horse rearing and reacting, which is completely what would happen if he heard a gunshot. You know, he'd react and throw his body weight, so you kind of get that great scene. So this is a nice, also a little, he doesn't really have as many, what I would say, urban escapes of these shanty towns, but it's kind of what an Old West town would look like at the time, you know, Utica or Cascade even, when they were coming up. So let me end on perhaps our most famous painting that you're aware of. The Exalted Ruler, one of the biggest works Russell has done, perhaps only matched by his great canvas in the House of Representatives. Now, he did this to my brothers as inscripted because he was an honorary member of the Elks Club, and it's called the Exalted Ruler because that's also what the leader of the Elks Club was called. And you can really see this beautiful depiction. This looks like to be, you know, right east of Glacier, where you can see the beautiful mountains right in sort of Browning territory. You've got the ruler who's, you know, in his prime. You've got perhaps the young bucks coming up. And then as you sweep through the canvas, you have the shedding of the antlers and perhaps the older elks going down. So this sort of cyclical change of the guard, so to speak. And, you know, Russell had these great, wonderful, majestic paintings, but he also has humor in his paintings and fun. And so you can even see, if you're looking, he rewards a close looker. This great little partridge that is just kind of hidden in the foreground. So for those who come to look and see, you can always catch a little extra in a Russell painting. So thank you for joining me. I hope you got to see a few of our more exciting paintings and learned a little, and come visit us.